The morning sun painted long shadows across my land as I stood with my coffee, watching the bulldozer's claw rip into the barn's faded siding. The boards gave way with a sharp crack, splintering as clouds of dust rose into the crisp air. Down the gravel drive, sleek cars began pulling up. Their passengers stepped out in suits and gowns, blinking at the demolition site like it was some kind of surreal mirage. That's when I saw her, Karen Henderson, frozen at the edge of the wreckage, her lavender mother of the bride dress stark against the rubble-strewn backdrop. Her mouth hung open, her clipboard clutched in a death grip, as the bulldozer idled behind her like a beast satisfied with its kill. The look on her face, worth every dollar I spent on the emergency demolition. But let me take you back to how this all started. 3 months earlier, I inherited my Uncle Frank's 20-acre property on the outskirts of Willowbrook Estates, a well-manicured, rule-obsessed neighborhood governed by a notorious HOA. The land came with a sagging old barn that Uncle Frank had occasionally lent out for local gatherings, a few church picnics, maybe a family reunion or two. But it hadn't hosted anything in years. The roof leaked, the beams were soft, and I had every intention of tearing it down and repurposing the space. That's when Karen entered my life. She showed up unannounced one sunny morning, speed walking up my driveway in designer athletic wear, clipboard already in hand. She introduced herself as the HOA president with a polished smile that didn't reach her eyes and launched into a pitch about neighborhood character and heritage structures. When I mentioned my plans to demolish the barn, her demeanor shifted, eyes glittering with what I can only call opportunistic delight. She spoke in a syrupy voice about how the barn had charm and was beloved by the community. I made it clear it was private land and not a public venue. She left, still smiling, but I could sense trouble. 6 weeks later, a florist's van showed up at my gate. The driver asked where to deliver the arrangements for the Henderson wedding. I told him he had the wrong place, until he showed me an order form with my address printed in bold. The next day, a caterer arrived, confused and asking about kitchen access. She pulled up emails from ethanvenuemanager@gmail.com. My name's Ethan, sure, but I've never run a venue, and that wasn't my email. My stomach dropped. Someone was impersonating me. I called Karen immediately. She answered like she was expecting me, chirpy and unbothered. When I questioned her, she laughed it off, claimed it was all a mix-up. But when I pressed, her tone shifted. She admitted her daughter was getting married and said they assumed the barn was still available since it had been used before. Then she had the gall to guilt-trip me, said I was heartless for canceling last minute and ruining the dreams of 150 guests. I hung up and called my lawyer. He confirmed my worst fears. Karen had used my address to book vendors under a fake identity. While the contracts were fraudulent, courts might still allow the wedding to proceed under the principle of detrimental reliance. Vendors and the couple had acted in good faith. With just 10 days until the wedding, a legal challenge could drag on for weeks. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The barn wasn't just run down, it was a safety hazard. I'd already gotten quotes to demolish it. The next morning, I called the county's building inspector. I requested an urgent structural review. By 5 p.m. that day, I had a signed report. The barn was unsafe for public use. Monday morning, the emergency demolition permit was issued. The wedding? Scheduled for Saturday. I hired a crew and paid triple for a Friday morning job. Karen, according to her social media posts, had a 7 a.m. salon appointment that morning. So did the entire bridal party. The timing was perfect. By 10 a.m., the barn was a memory. The crew had reduced it to rubble, loading the debris into dumpsters. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching the dust settle. That's when the wedding guests began to arrive. First came a string quartet, confused and fiddling with cases. Then the florist returned, followed by a van of folding chairs. Calls flooded my phone, but I ignored them. At 11:15 a.m., Karen's white SUV skidded into view. She launched from the vehicle like a missile, curls bouncing from her salon session, her expression melting from horror to rage. She stormed across the grass in heels, shrieking that I'd ruined her daughter's big day and destroyed their family's lives. The bride, who I assumed was the young woman now sobbing behind her, stood flanked by confused guests. I stood slowly, placed my coffee on the porch railing, and pulled out my phone. First, I showed Karen the inspector's report, then the demolition permit. Finally, I played a recording of our call from the previous week where she admitted to assuming the barn was available and acknowledged she hadn't received permission. But the real gut punch? I handed her printed documentation from my lawyer. The fake email traced to an IP address originating from her home, a domain registration for the venue website using her credit card, and time-stamped activity that perfectly matched her personal schedule. The crowd turned on her instantly. The bride's family demanded answers. Vendors shouted about deposits. The groom's father threatened legal action. Karen tried to deflect, claiming it was a miscommunication. No one bought it. I slipped back into my house as the yelling grew louder. From my living room window, I watched squad cars arrive. Apparently, one of the florists had called the police. I gave them everything: emails, phone rings. 3 weeks later, I heard she was voted off the HOA board in an emergency session. The vendors filed a joint civil lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract. But the real kicker? The state filed criminal charges: identity theft, criminal impersonation, and fraud totaling over $5,000. Karen's real estate license, used to lend credibility to her fake bookings, was suspended pending review. I saw her last at her arraignment. Gone was the polished suburban tyrant. She stood trembling before the judge, pale and quiet. She pled not guilty, but her lawyer was already in the hall discussing a plea deal. Prosecutors were aiming for 18 months, though she'd likely get probation and a hefty fine. The civil case settled out of court. My lawyer heard it cost her over $75,000 in damages and legal fees. She took out a second mortgage to cover it all. When the judge read the possible sentence, up to 5 years and $50,000 in fines, Karen swayed where she stood, clutching her lawyer's arm to stay upright. And as for me, I finally built that garden I'd always wanted where the barn used to stand. No weddings, no trespassers, just peace.